So far, we've talked about the process that JavaScript uses to look up variables or to identify or resolve an identifier using a scope chain. And a scope is just an object, and a chain is just a bunch of those scopes linked together. And then we looked at how a scope can get attached to a function at the time that it is created. In this video, I'm going to show you how various scopes get created. To start us off, I created this function here and assigned it to the myFunction variable. And over in the debugger, I typed in my function into a watch expression so we can take a look at the resulting object. The thing I want to point your attention to is notice that there's this private looking property on here called function scope. And notice that it's associated with the function object itself. We haven't even called the function yet, but it has this property that is called function scope. I can drill into it and take a look at what it is. And notice it looks like an object that has properties and values. Now, we normally can't access the function scope directly, but the Chrome debugger gives us a way to look at it through the debugger. Now, by default, there's a scope that's created for us automatically, and it's called the global scope. And the global scope is just an object like any of the other scopes that we've seen so far. And you can see it right here. It's been automatically attached to our function. And if I expand it and look at what the global scope is, you can see that it's the window object in the browser. If we were using this in Node.js, the global scope would be the global object. And it's generally where all of the global symbols go. So this will be the last place in the chain that JavaScript will look to get the value of a variable. Let me show you how this works by creating a body inside of this function, and we'll just print to the console the value of some variable. I'll call it my variable. Then over in the console, let me erase all the pen. I'll type my function and we'll call it, and I should get an error because my variable isn't defined yet. But let's go ahead and put my variable in the global scope. We know that the global scope is window, so I'll type window.myVariable. And now this time if I call the function, because window is in the scope chain, it should have a value, and that value gets returned as some value. Over in the watch expression area, if I look at my function and expand into the function scope, you can see the global scope attached here. And if I scroll down, way down to the bottom, you should see the variable that we created in the global scope. So this global scope or window is created for us automatically, and it's always the last scope in the chain of scopes. So next up, we'll look at how to create additional scopes. We can create our own scopes by using something called a closure. And a closure just means we're going to use a function, and anything inside of that function will be in its own local scope that can then follow other functions around. So let me show you an example. Instead of just having my function here, I'm going to create another function around it. And so we'll call that outer function. And then inside of outer function, I'm going to return my function. And then I'll name it here so that we can see it more easily in the debugger. Now at this point, we haven't defined my variable, but what I'm going to go ahead and do is define it here in the outer function, inside of the body of the outer function. Now we haven't actually called the outer function yet, and so nothing has happened. But when we do call that function, a scope object will get created, specifically a local scope object. But then that local scope object will get attached to this function when it gets created and then follow it around for its entire lifespan. And so it'll get hooked up into the scope chain when we call this function. And it stays with the function throughout its entire lifespan. No matter what we do with this, we could pass it somewhere else and it will always get the scope object that was created here. And so this is called a closure because we're using a function to create an additional scope. So I'll create a variable in the console called myFunction, and we'll assign that to the result of calling the outer function. So keep in mind that now we're calling the function, so we're going to create a local scope, and then that local scope will get attached to the resulting function. Let's take a look by typing console.dir. And then drilling in and taking a look at the function scope property. So notice now we have in the chain of scopes, we have something called a closure now, and the closure was created for us simply by creating this function inside of another function. And so inside the closure object, we have one variable or one property called myVariable, and it has a value. And then the next scope in the chain is the global scope, which is window. Now let's change my variable here to something like a. And then inside of my function, let's create another one called b. And then we'll just return the result of adding a and b together. And before we do that, I'll attach a debugger statement so that we can pause in the debugger. So what we're going to do is to call the outer function again, which will return this inner function, and then we'll call the inner function, and what we want to do is to draw out its scope chain at the time that we call it. So let's draw those tables and then take a look at it in the debugger. So I've drawn the three scope objects that get created here, and this one at the front of the chain is called the local scope, and this is going to get created when we call the inner function here. And the variable that's defined here is b, and it has a value of 20. And then this scope object will hook up to its parent, which will be this scope up here. And so we have a variable there called a, and that value is 10. And then this scope object will hook up to the parent scope object, which in this case is the global scope, or the window object. And there we'll have a ton of variables and values. So let's go ahead and create an inner function variable, and I'll assign it to the result of calling outer function again. Great, now we get back a function, and if I want, I can inspect it, and we can take a look at its scope chain. So notice that the scope chain has the first closure here with a variable a and a value of 10. That's this one. And then the next one in the chain is the global object, and that has a whole ton of variables, and that's this one. Now the reason that this local scope hasn't been created yet is because we haven't actually called the local function yet. So what we can do is to go over into the console and call the function, which will drop us into the debugger, and we can take a look at it there. Down in the JavaScript console, I went ahead and called the inner function, which dropped us into the debug point. And if you look over into the scope variables section of the debugger, you'll now see that we have a new scope called this local scope. And it has two properties in it, one with a key of b and a value of 20. That's our variable here. And then it also stores the thisarg, which currently points to window. Then the next scope object is this closure, and there we see the scope object with a variable of a and a value of 10, and then finally the window scope object, which has all the global symbols. Before we conclude, let me show you one more example to make sure that it's clear how to create these scopes and check it out in the debugger. So I'm going to create a function, we'll just call it func. And what I'll do is create a variable inside this scope called a, and I'll just assign it to 1. And what this function will do is return another function. So we're going to create a new function. And inside of that, we'll create a variable called b. And then I'll finally return the last inner function. And we'll create another variable here called c. And this will just print out the result of calling c plus b plus a, or a plus b plus c. And I'll put a debugger statement here so we can play around in the console. Now, what we'll do is just start calling this function, and we'll keep doing this until we get to the inner function. And that should finally drop us into the debugger, where we can take a look at the scope variables on the right. So notice, because we've called this function inside of here, we start off in the local scope. And in local scope, we have one variable called c with a value of 3, and then the thisarg. And then the next scope in the chain is this closure that was created here, and it has a variable b. And then the next one in the chain is this closure that was created here, and it has one variable a, which has a value of 1. And then finally we have the global scope, even though we're not using anything from it. We can use our newfounded knowledge of scope and closures to do some pretty cool patterns. For example, what I've done here is created a variable called result and assigned it to a function that executes right away. So I've used this special syntax here to run this function right away. And that will create a closure. And inside that closure, I can put private variables that I only want visible to functions that are created inside of the closure. So what I've done is I've created a private variable here called value, and this isn't visible anywhere else other than inside of here. Then I return an object using object literal syntax with two properties, one called value and one called increment, where I actually create a new function for the values of these properties. So remember that inside, when we use this function syntax here, we're actually creating a new function. And because we create the function inside of this closure, this value variable is visible to this because it's in the scope chain. And we can also mutate that value like we do inside of this increment method, and we'll be incrementing this private value. So let me show you what I mean over in the console. So first I'll type result, and notice that we get an object here, and the object has these two properties, increment and value. And I can call the value function, and we should get back a result of 0. It's 1 because I was just playing with it, so let's try it again. Okay, when I refresh the browser, the result is actually 0. But then if I call the increment function, and then the value function again, it's now 1. And so we have a private variable here called value, and what we're doing is we're getting its value when we call the value method, and we're changing it when we call the increment method. But we're not able to actually see that value anywhere else. We can't even inspect it here in the debugger because it's private to the scope of the result. We could see it if we drop a debug statement inside of one of these functions. And then what I'll do is call result.value. And inside the debugger, you can look over at the scope variables and see that there's this value variable. So in this video, we looked more closely at how to create scopes by using closures. And we looked at creating closures by using functions. Then we looked at how to inspect the closure or the scope chain that gets created by using the debugger and the scope variable section of the Chrome debugger. You also saw how the global scope or window in the browser or global in Node is the last scope object in the chain, and when we call a function, the local scope is the first object in the lookup chain.